recognize the member for Fredericton West Hanwell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it was interesting to me to hear the comments of the honourable member opposite. I think that there is much in this bill that we can get behind. I appreciate the fact that he's looking forward to updating some of the rules and some of the name changes. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot more here than just simply name changes, and I want to point to some of those things. Mr. Speaker, I've raised concerns before that what I see from this government is a pattern where they're seeking to centralize power in their executive branch, and particularly in the Premier's office. And their mantra seems to be, just trust us, we know what's best for you. And that, frankly, Mr. Speaker, is a traditional Liberal value that I don't share. I believe very much in democracy and transparency, and my concern is that this bill, although it's being sold to us here today as a housekeeping bill, that in fact is quite substantive in its changes. And we've seen a pattern of this behavior. You know, very early on, I raised some concerns about legislative rule changes. This government then repealed the Fiscal Accountability and Transparency Act. Then they repealed the Taxpayers Protection Act, two pieces of legislation that are central to transparency and accountability in government. Those are things this government repealed right off the bat, some of the first things it did getting into office. And then we had the general creation of a super procurement entity, the new Service New Brunswick, and we've yet to see how that's rolling out, Mr. Speaker. We're yet to see if there's real economies being realized there, or if it's in fact just more opportunities for this government to slush around with its friends. And now, most recently, we've seen some issues with the potential amalgamation of legislative officers. And we know that legislative officers can be a thorn in the side of government, and indeed they've faced this already, and yet now they're looking at amalgamating and eliminating some of those positions, and that's a real concern. And then we have a questionable dismissal of civil servants, both senior and even some junior ones, over the last year, culminating right now in the question regarding the dismissal of the Chief Medical Officer of Health in the province. And now we're looking at what I believe is a fairly substantive change to a key piece of procurement legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing more central to what we do in this House than track the way the people's money is spent. That's a central function of what we do. It's at the core of our parliamentary democracy, the freedom of speech, and also tracking where the money goes. Those are the two functions of this legislature. And indeed, this bill seeks, I believe, to limit the transparency into that process. So we've seen, and you've heard a lot of it, Mr. Speaker, concerns about the fact that this government, that the executive branch of this government, over 6 ministers of this government, are the same people that brought us ATCON. And ATCON occurred because, in my opinion, ministers and cabinet had the ability to go outside of the rules. And so the reaction of this government is obviously to change the rules that limit them and give those positions more power. That's exactly the wrong direction, Mr. Speaker. We've had some discussions about history in this House, but I'll tell you, there's an old adage that says that those that don't understand their history are doomed to repeat it. And that's exactly my concern here with the ATCON issue and the future of this province, because we've seen not only the same people, but the same processes in place. And in fact, what we're seeing is as I've enumerated, a litany of legislation that now actually gives more power, more discretionary power to those very ministers. So you have the same people, and you have processes that are now less robust than they were at the time of ATCON. And that's a real concern. And I'm further concerned that the solution that this government sees to that, when they're faced with an issue where the minister was found to be outside the regulations, now they're just going and changing all the regulations that could potentially get in the way of their arbitrary process. And, Mr. Speaker, it's quite poignant, quite timely, that this bill, in fact, was introduced on the very day that the Auditor General announced that she's going to look further into the ATCON issue. And we all know that ATCON scandal came about through inappropriate conduct, the minister acting outside of rules, and came through lack of due diligence. And now we see a government that is in fact shamelessly proposing to eliminate further oversight on some of the largest capital projects this province is going to encounter in the next 20 years by removing the NB Power projects specifically from the Crown Construction Act. That's a real concern, Mr. Speaker. And the minister even quoted it himself, but I'm going to quote it again. The inclusion of the terms joint venture, strategic partnership, or financial arrangement, the exclusion of those from a procurement process and the delegation of those powers to entities outside a procurement process is deeply troubling, Mr. Speaker. And these point directly back to regulations that were created under renewable energy projects under the Electricity Act. So the controls that existed not very long ago are now being eroded away, Mr. Speaker. And this bill is a clear continuation of this government's interference in NB Power, because now there are no requirements for projects to go through a tendering process. For example, the government now, under this Act, will be able to direct NB Power to purchase electricity from whoever they desire. And it affects directly major Crown projects. And we all know, Mr. Speaker, I've said it before and I'll say it again, Mactaquac Dam is essential to the future of this province. And the refurbishment of Mactaquac Dam is a decision that needs to be taken in 2016. It is very much about the future. And Mr. Speaker, it is particularly troubling that this short piece of legislation seeks to exempt NB Power major Crown capital projects from a procurement process. Now, I believe NB Power should be run as a business, but we need transparency and oversight on their procurements. Because, Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if we empower people with the ability to make arbitrary decisions on major Crown procurement projects, and indeed the refurbishment of the Mactaquac Dam could be the largest capital procurement project in a generation, Mr. Speaker. Billions of dollars. We need more oversight over such projects. What we don't need is this bill that's offering an exemption for such projects. Now, I'm concerned that their previous changes to and amendments to the Electricity Act and now these new regulations are going to leave these major projects immune to legislative oversight. And, Mr. Speaker, this House has a role. One of the key roles of this House is to track where the people's money goes. And we need that visibility, we need that transparency, we need that oversight and that accountability. All elements that this bill is removing specifically. Now, it does beg the question, why is NB Power specifically sectioned out? It's not the only Crown corporation. There are others. There's the community college system. There's ANBL. There are other Crown corporations. Why is it that this entity, NB Power, is specifically singled out? Well, to me, the answer is clear. The Minister of Energy and Mines has specific energy projects he wants built, and he knows they won't get built if he's required to go through a proper procurement process. Not only that, but these are major projects. They're very juicy, and we need to have further legislative oversight on them. So, Mr. Speaker, it is deeply troubling that on the same day that the Auditor General announces that she needs to go deeper into the ATCON fiasco, this government tables a bill to allow for exactly the same problems to now arise within NB Power. And taxpayers are already footing the ATCON bill. It will be ratepayers that are footing the bill for the Energy Minister's desire to pick and choose which projects are built in New Brunswick and by who they are built. And as we all know, Mr. Speaker, the taxpayers and the ratepayers are the same group of New Brunswickers. It's all the citizens of New Brunswick. And at the end of the day, the bill is going to land with them. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are other aspects of the bill that further diminish oversight. Both of the new sections contain sections that state that the Regulation Act does not apply to the changes. In other words, oversight that's in place now for the development of any regulations is eliminated. Again, speaking to the issue of removal of the oversight mechanisms that have been in place, as we've heard from the Minister, for now over 20 years. Mr. Speaker, this is about the future of New Brunswick. We face major capital projects, specifically capital projects coming through NB Power, those decisions are going to be landing on the lap of this government. And they need to be decisive, Mr. Speaker. But they also need to work with this legislature to ensure that there's proper transparency and accountability. And I am deeply concerned that this bill removes the existing transparency and accountability. And it further singles out NB Power projects, which will be some of the largest capital projects this province will face in a generation, specifically rules those out. So, Mr. Speaker, I've given you some of my deep concerns about this issue. I think they're pretty clear. We need more transparency, not less, and so I will not be supporting this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.